out. Uses Mark's account as I guess we would say the primary account. Mark chapter 5, beginning in verse 22, and we have see somebody's not sitting in her scriptural seat, and she's displaced some people back there. Been here 30 years, and I apologize, Hugh. All right. Matthew 5, beginning in verse 22. And behold, one of the rulers of the synagogue, named Jairus by name, and when he saw him, he fell at his feet and begged him earnestly, saying, My little daughter lies at the point of death. Come and lay your hands on her, that she may be healed, and she will live. So Jesus went with him, and a great multitude followed him and thronged him. Now a certain woman had a flow or an issue of blood for 12 years, and had suffered many things from many physicians. She had spent all that she had, and was no better, but rather grew worse. When she heard about Jesus, she came from behind in the crowd and touched his garment, for she said, If only I may touch his clothes, I shall be made well. Immediately the fountain of her blood was dried up, and she felt in her body that she was healed of the affliction. And Jesus, immediately knowing in himself that power had gone out of him, turned around in the crowd and said, Who touched my clothes? But his disciples said to him, You see the multitude thronging you, and yet you say, Who touched me? And he looked around to see her who had done this thing. But the woman, fearing and trembling, knowing what had happened to her, came and fell down before him and told him the whole truth. And he said to her, Daughter, your faith has made you well. Go in peace and be healed of your affliction. While he was still speaking, some came from the ruler of the synagogue's house, who said, Your daughter is dead. Why trouble the teacher any further? As soon as Jesus heard the word of the servant who was dear to him, as soon as Jesus heard the word that was spoken, and he said to the ruler of the synagogue, Do not be afraid, only believe. And he permitted no one to follow him except Peter, James, and John, the brother of James. Then he came to the house of the ruler of the synagogue and saw a tumult, and those who wept and wailed loudly. When he came in, he said to them, Why make this commotion and weep? The child is not dead, but sleeping. And they ridiculed him. But when he had put them all aside, he took the father and the mother of the child, and those who were with him, and entered where the child was laying. And he took the child by the hand and said to her, Talitha cumi, which is translated, Little girl, I say to you, arise. Immediately the girl arose and walked, for she was 12 years of age. And they were overcome with great amazement. But he commanded them strictly that no one should know it, and said that something should be given to her to eat. Now that's Mark's account. All right, Luke's account is a little bit different, or I guess we should say it adds a few details to the matter. But I also want to look at Matthew's account in chapter 9. In Matthew chapter 9. Now, at the end of this particular account, in verse 25 and 26, the Bible does not give us the statement that Jesus commanded the parents not to say anything. But we know that he did, because Mark's account tells us that. But Matthew's account says, and the report, and I'm reading this just for you to file this. I want you to file this statement away for when we get to the questions, okay? And the report of this went out into all that land. And the report of this went out into all that land. So we know that Jesus told the parents not to say anything. We know that he told Peter, James, and John not to say anything. And yet Matthew's account says the report of this went out throughout all the land. Now, I think there's a really important point to be made there, all right? But I'm not going to get to it right now. I just wanted you to be aware of the text so that when we get to the questions, it'll be in your mind. All right, so now this account is sometimes referred to, and I'd never heard of this, so I'll just have to take the brother's word for it that wrote the lesson. That it is sometimes referred to. Now this is in the third paragraph below the main section on the healing of Jairus' daughter and an invalid. And it says, this miracle is often called the parenthetical miracle, the miracle inside a miracle. And what it means is that the entire account starts and finishes with the daughter of the ruler of the synagogue. And then in the middle of the beginning of that, how that thing starts and how it ends, there's another miracle that takes place within the account of the miracle of Jairus' daughter. So that's why it's called the parenthetical miracle. In other words, here's something that's going along, and all of a sudden there's an interruption, and then we get back to the subject at hand. And so it's called the parenthetical miracle for that reason. Now we just want to spend a little bit of time, not too much, talking about the woman. Says she had an issue of blood for 12 years. And Mark says that she had spent everything she had on the physicians. Not only had she not been made well, she was worse. And then not only was she worse, she was broke. All right? And so that's the situation in which the woman finds herself. She's financially destitute, and she's worse, which likely means she's probably barely able to even work or try to provide for herself in any way. People who deal with what sometimes we refer to as low blood. People are anemic. They lack strength. They lack energy. They lack endurance. And this would have been this woman's situation for going on now 12 years. 12 years she'd been sick. And I think what we have to understand is the nature of her disability, and the fact that as soon as she was healed, she could feel it. In other words, the illness, the ailment that she had was such that it affected everything about her, and then to all of a sudden not have any of those, not only to be healed of the problem, but to be restored was an immediate feeling. You could be, for example, and this may not be a great example, but just by illustration, you might, or a person might, and this happens, might inadvertently find out that they have cancer. Right? I mean, sometimes people go to the doctor for whatever reason. They go in for a test for one thing, and then they find out maybe they have cancer. And the cancer is such that it's not really affecting their body or their health. Right? Now, if that person was to be healed of that cancer immediately, they wouldn't know any different, right? But this was a debilitating situation where, she just felt like garbage all the time. And immediately, not only is she better, she's full strength. And all because all she wanted to do was touch the clothes of Jesus. She didn't, she wasn't like many, like the centurion or any other that felt like they needed to, that they needed to talk to Jesus, go to it, to know that, for him to know that they were in the presence of Jesus, or that Jesus, might need to touch them in order for them to be healed. You remember, many of the healings of Jesus involved him, putting his hands on an individual. For example, in Matthew chapter 8, verses 1 through 4, you had the leper. And the Bible says Jesus, had compassion on him and touched. He said, "Master, if you're willing, you can make me clean." And Jesus had compassion on him, and he said, "I'm willing. I'm willing." But there's power in the fact that Jesus had touched that man. Because if he was a leper, nobody touched him. And as human beings, in varying quantities, we crave human touch. Is that right? Look, now there's some people, some people are huggers and some people are not. All right? But in some respect, we all crave human touch. This man as a leper had never, nobody had touched him perhaps in years. And so we find Jesus putting his hand on this individual and healing him. So there was the healing, and then there was the physical contact. Jesus intended to go to the centurion's house and heal that servant, right? We might infer that Jesus was going to put his hands on him. And the centurion said, "What? No. You don't even have to come to my house. I'm not even fit for you to come in my house. Just say the word. Just say the word, and my servant will be healed." And Jesus marveled at his faith, right? And now we have yet an even, I hate to use the term extreme, but we have an even more extreme situation where this woman doesn't even want Jesus to know she's anywhere around. She just wants to be in the presence of Jesus. In other words, I don't have to be recognized. I don't have to be touched. He doesn't have to say anything. If I can just touch his garment, I will be healed. And to me, that's one of the greatest. This incident, I think, is one of the greatest acts of faith recorded in the New Testament. If I can just touch his clothes.
I hate to say it, but that was psychology.
Well,
you know what I mean, though.
Yeah. I wouldn't say it like that.
I know, but it's a good example.
But if I can just touch the hem of his garment, I'll be healed. And so then Jesus turns, and he's being thronged by the people. Now here's again, this is a terrible example, but I think it makes an accurate picture. Jesus is almost always going to be surrounded by people, right? I mean, there are people who are following him. There are what do we call the people that slow down? Rubberneckers. There's people that are just there to gawk or to watch from afar. There's always going to be a crowd of people around Jesus, but sometimes we would know that the crowds would swell, right? Now, here's the picture in my mind. This is why I tell you this is such a bad example, but here's the picture. And you tell me if this didn't happen at your high school. Two guys are going to fight. All right? And they're going to fight at a particular location, either right off the school grounds or where when I was in high school, we're going to the cemetery. There's a ton of cemeteries, but if you said you're going to the cemetery, There's going to be a fight at the cemetery. We all knew which cemetery we were going to. And so this thing starts. This announcement is made that there's going to be a fight. And if you were, for example, if you're walking off campus to fight, what happens the longer you walk? Word gets out, right? Where y'all going? Oh, Johnny and Mike are going to fight. Oh man, I'm in. And then the crowd just swells and swells and swells and swells. Right? So now, and then by the time you get there, man, there's just a massive group of people, right? Is that how it works? Is that how it works? Okay, I just want to make sure that my high school was the only one that wasn't the only one that worked that way. All right.
I have to send off a quick text so everybody.
Yeah, now they just text everybody. Yeah.
And they all get their videos out.
Yeah. But back in the day, the crowd would swell when the word of mouth got out, right? So there's this crowd that's going to be around Jesus at all times. But now all of a sudden a man comes up and he's a ruler of the synagogue. He's well known because a synagogue is kind of like a local church. It existed to serve the Jewish families in a particular area. Had to be at least 10. If there were 10 men, 10 families involved, you could have a synagogue. Now, by the way, synagogue, I don't want to say that synagogues are unbiblical, but they are non-biblical. In other words, they weren't against the law of Moses, but you can't find them in the law of Moses. All right? So here's Jesus with this crowd, and all of a sudden the ruler of the synagogue approaches Jesus, and he says, my daughter is sick, and Luke's guy says, she's dying. She's dying. And if you'll come and heal her, she'll live. Now what happens? Jesus said, I'll go. And he starts walking. And he's walking with the ruler of the synagogue. Now what do you think's going to happen in that crowd? It's like, Jesus is going to heal Jairus' daughter, y'all. Crowd starts swelling. He's walking down these narrow streets, and the crowd just continues to grow and to grow and to grow. And before he can get to the house of the ruler of the synagogue, some sickly, pale, weak woman manages to push her way through the crowd and put her hand on Jesus.
How did her faith? You think she got that just listening and hearing about Jesus? I mean, that took a lot of faith.
Yeah, all I can tell from what the text says is that she heard that Jesus was there.
How did she know?
Well, I'm going to say that kind of like Zacchaeus. When he heard that Jesus was coming, he'd heard enough about Jesus that he was going to climb a tree. And I got to see who this guy is. I've been hearing all about this Jesus character, this Jesus of Nazareth. And so I'm going to make sure that when he comes by, I'm going to climb this tree so I can at least lay my eyes on this guy and see what all the hubbub is about. Same thing with this woman. By the way, there are other examples of this. For example, the two blind men. This Bible says they heard that Jesus was passing by. And they just started crying out, Son of David, have mercy on us. Son of David, have mercy on us. In other words, they had heard about Jesus. And then when they heard that Jesus was in their vicinity, they just started shouting to the best of their ability to gain the attention of. Oh man, yeah. I'd like to have half the faith of that woman, because that'd be a whole lot more than I probably have now. Oh man, yeah. And so what I'm gathering is these streets they're packed, okay? Because ancient streets are pretty narrow passageways, and it's full of people. But to me, the key is Jesus knew something had happened. He said it with his own mouth. He said, I perceive that some power has gone out of me. And there's an interesting statement here in paragraph, big paragraph 1, 2, 3, 4. At the end of the fourth paragraph, that says, he felt the miracle. He felt the miracle. It says, we do not know, and I'd never really thought about this until we started digging in this. He did not know, we do not know exactly what this did to Jesus, but it appears that every miracle may have cost him something. In other words, there was more to it than Jesus just doing it and going on his merry way.
Those things, I mean, it blows my mind to think about the work that he did while he was here. I mean, I can't see where he ever invested that.
He got very little. You know,
Everywhere he went.
And again, and we have to remember, look, Jesus was, and this, don't misunderstand what I'm saying, okay? Jesus was not Superman. You know, with this endless amount of energy and strength, you know, and ability to press on. You know what I mean by that, right? You know, like Superman, he never gets tired, right? Because he's Superman. Jesus was not Now, Jesus was Superman, but he wasn't Superman in the comic hero sense of Superman. You know, he got tired. We read John 4 when he's walking through Samaria. It's noontime. Says he is already wearied from the journey. He's sitting down. He needs drink. And so it seems like perhaps that even every miracle that he performed took something out of him.
Did he ever refuse? I can't remember. Did he ever refuse to do a miracle?
All right. Let me qualify the word refused. Okay. The Bible tells us that Jesus that he refused to do miracles in certain places because the people did not receive him. So he did not very many miracles there, except he laid his hands on a few sick folk, is what the Bible says. But that had to do with the lack of reception on the part of the people to Jesus. In other words, Jesus didn't just go in there and force himself on the people and say, look, I'm here to do miracles and I'm going to do some miracles. No, the people, when the people received him, he would go in and do miracles. But when the people did not receive him, then the Bible says he did not do many miracles there. So in that sense, he refused to do miracles among unbelievers, but Jesus never refused to do a miracle when somebody was brought to him. Because we find, you know, there were many sick folk. Again, we could go back to Matthew chapter 8. You know, they brought him, it talks about all the different types of sick folks. It says they brought them to Jesus, and here's the line. He healed them all. He healed them all. I mean, can you imagine what that must have been like? Just almost like Moses judging the people from daylight to dark, right? I mean, it had to be exhausting. It had to be exhausting. And so, and I think, you know, again, to use a modern film reference, you know, man, I love the movie The Green Mile. And, you know, and in that movie, Big John, every time he did a miracle, it took something out of him. And that's kind of the picture that I see that when Jesus would do miracles, it would be physically exhausting for him. It wasn't just a snap of the finger, or, you know, like sometimes we just, you know, like it wasn't like Jesus went down there like Oprah, miracle for you, miracle for you, miracle for you. He put his hands on people. He dealt with them, and it was taxing on him, you know, physically and mentally, emotionally. And so I'd never really thought about it until I started digging into this, you know, that this would have been hard on him. it would have been hard on him. And so we have the miracle. We have the miracle of the woman with the issue of blood. All right. Now on the next page, as soon as this miracle is accomplished, word comes to Jairus. Your daughter is dead. Your daughter is dead. Don't trouble Jesus anymore. Don't trouble Jesus anymore. Now, that tells us a little bit about the attitude of the people that brought the message, right? Because apparently they thought if she was dead, there was no sense in Jesus coming, right? Is that right? So they didn't think Jesus could do anything about it after she had died. And there's probably a sense in which Jairus didn't think that Jesus could do anything. Because the Bible says Jesus immediately turns to him and said, listen, just believe. I mean, look at what the text, what the text says. It says, no, I'm in Matthew's account. Let me move. Mark 5:36. The word comes in verse 35. Your daughter is dead. Don't trouble this man anymore. The teacher. As soon as Jesus heard the word that was spoken, he said to the ruler of the synagogue, do not be afraid. Believe. In other words, Jesus immediately steps in between the messengers and the ruler. He doesn't want him to hurt even for 1 second. Not even for 1 second. Just believe. Do not be afraid. Just believe. And they go on. Then they go on to the house, and he and his wife and the inner circle, the three of the inner circle go in. And Jesus just took her by the hand and said, little girl, arise. She got up. Little girl, arise. And she got up. Of course, Jesus again charges them not to say anything about it. Man, I'm going to run out of time. Let me just jump to this. Because I told you, he told them not to say anything, but the other account said word got out in all the land. Here's my understanding of that. Oftentimes the testimony of others is greater than the testimony of the one who receives the blessing. All right? Take somebody that's lived a life that's not been very good. All right? Some rowdy young man, kind of a troublemaker, wild child, however you want to describe it. And then that individual is transformed by the power of the gospel, right? Becomes a Christian, and they change. What is a greater testimony? The person saying, hey, I used to be this, but I changed? Or somebody else saying, hey, he used to be that, but he changed? What's a greater testimony? It's the testimony of the others, right? Because people can say they've changed all day long, can't they? When they may or may not have changed. But the evidence of the change being witnessed by others, in my opinion, is the greater testimony. I could tell people. I'll just give you an example. I was in a meeting last year, first week of March, in Covington, Tennessee. In a meeting in Covington, Tennessee. And on Sunday morning of that meeting, one of my Freed-Hardeman classmates was there, Christy Glass. And I just sitting there preaching along, and I knew she went to church there, but it was a pretty big congregation. And all of a sudden I looked up and I spotted her. And I just stopped. And I said, "Hey, Christy Glass." And she just grinned, big pretty smile. And I said, "I'm not the guy you used to be. Or I'm not the guy you used to know." Now, it was evident by the fact that I was standing in the pulpit preaching the gospel meeting, right? That I'm not the guy that she used to know. Right. But those testimonies say more than any person could say about themselves, right? When I brag on people that I know have lived not really good lives, to me that's far better. That's far better than that person having to tell somebody, right? And so that's why I think again, I can't prove that's why Jesus said what he said to them. But Jesus knew word was going to get out, because those people knew that girl was dead. Because he said she's asleep. She's not dead. She's asleep. And the Bible says they ridiculed him. That doesn't mean like they mocked him in a laughing way. It's like, are you an idiot? What's wrong with you? We know she's dead. Why would you say something so dumb as that she's not dead when we all know she's dead? See, they ridiculed him for saying what he said. But when they saw her alive, the parents didn't have to say anything to anybody, right? All the people who knew the girl was dead ran as fast as they could all through the streets and the neighborhood, telling everybody what Jesus had done for that child. And so, to me, the lesson here is the power of the testimony of others. As the proverb says, let another man praise you and not your own mouth. You see? And I think that's why. I think that's why it played out there. I can't prove it, but that's just me. All right? All right, so next week, we'll start at the bottom of that second page on believing as the key word, and we'll run through the questions, but be prepared to get into lesson 43.